Hello, Year Nines. Hope you're well. So in today's lesson, we're going to look at, well, how do we program? We're going to continue our journey into learning how to use Python and write instructions in this coding language called Python. In today's lesson, we're going to look at variables in a little bit more detail. Now, in the previous lesson, we learned about how to output something to the screen. It doesn't really matter what it was. We were able to output some strings to our screens. We know that we were outputting strings because, well, that part in the bracket is some text that is surrounded by speech marks. We know that we're outputting because we're using that keyword print to get something output on our screens. So when this code is run, it will output the string, your text goes here. But what if we wanted to use variables or use something stored in memory and then output it later on in our code? What if we didn't actually know what it is that we wanted to output in our code until the user entered some inputs, which actually we're going to talk about in next week's lesson. But for today, we're just going to understand how we can use variables to store some data and then use it afterwards. A variable is a value stored in memory that can change. Previously, we've used variables in block code all the time, especially when we were doing microbits. If you remember back to year 7, when we created our tug of war games, we had an LED that shone in the middle of our screens, and the value of that X coordinate for that LED would change depending on the buttons that were being pressed. So basically what that meant was that the value that was inside of our variable could change because it is variable. But our identifier, which we used in that instance called rope, never changed. So the identifier stays the same, but the value inside of it can. In block code, this is what it looked like when we set our variable. In Python, it is super easy to create variables and assign a value to it. For instance, all we really have to do is write our variable identifier, rope, an equal sign, and then our value 2 on the right hand side. In these examples, the identifier on the first one is age and the value is 12. In the middle, the identifier is name and the value is Mr. Socotra. And on the right hand side, which is Python, the identifier is city, but the value is Leicester. So going back to our previous example, when we run this piece of code, the value 2 will be assigned to the variable called rope. We use the equal sign to assign values, which are on the right, to variable identifiers or just variables on the left. The data type that we're using here is an integer because the number 2 is just an integer, it's a whole number. But if I were to change that and have speech marks there instead, then all of a sudden the data type changes to a string. Now, this might not seem like too much of a change, and in actual fact, for this lesson, it's not. But I just wanted to illustrate the fact that if we've got a bit of text that has the number 2 in it, then we can't do any mathematics on it. If we want to do some maths on a number, which we will do eventually, we will have to make sure that those variables or the inputs that we're asking the user for are numbers or integers. And it's the equal sign in the middle that we use to assign values to a variable. Remember, variables are just a way of storing pieces of data in your program. We can then use that data afterwards in our lesson today, all we're really going to do is store some values in a variable and then use it pretty much straight away. But in the real world, we might not need to use those variables for a long while, so we need somewhere to keep them safe. A few quick rules about variables in Python. They can't have spaces in them. They can't have any symbols other than an underscore. And they cannot begin with numbers. For example, we can have call variable 5, which is okay, but we can't have the number 5 at the start of that variable name.